Tonight, let's talk about everyone's favorite subject, which is life. Life. What is it about? What are we here for? Everybody has to ask this question at least once or twice in their lives. Sometimes, as you look at the arena of life, it looks as if a number of people are playing a number of completely different games. And that is the format I want to look at the subject in tonight. The games of life, leading up to the master game. This is inspired by a book published in the 60s by a Robert DeRopp, and it was called The Master Game, and I certainly encourage you to read it. It's still very much relevant. Well, we see that various thinkers have thought about these different games of life and have characterized it in different ways. The most famous is that of Abraham Maslow, who came up with a famous hierarchy of needs, which is a pyramid. At the bottom here is just pure survival, right? Then social esteem, then prestige in the world, and at the top, what he calls self-actualization. And that's a very useful and very popular model. Another, more obscure, but equally fascinating model is that of the theorist Clare Graves, who came up with the concept of spiral dynamics. And that would be a lecture or two in itself, but basically you're starting at this level and spiraling up, or you're starting at beige, again, the level of survival, and you're at the top, which is, he used them in colors, and at the coral is presumably some kind of metaphysical sublimity that he didn't really talk much about. I'm going to put it in terms of games for this one reason. Because when you look at Maslow's and Graves's pictures, you get the impression they're almost like grades in school. Well, you first get the survival part down, and then you get the social esteem part down, and then you get the self-actualization part down, and at some point, you get your 8th grade diploma. And somehow life really doesn't fit into this rather neat grade school system. And that's why I want to speak of it in terms of games. Because, as I said, various people seem to be playing different games. I want to emphasize that everybody is playing all of the games, mostly, that I'm going to be talking about here. And no one really stops playing them, except maybe the master game. You don't stop playing the survival game. In fact, let's start with the survival game. It's the most basic thing we have to do: survive. As a proverb said, a man may have many problems. A man who has no bread has only one. Now, survival can take a lot of different forms. You could be living in a third world slum with no running water and really quite unsure of where the bread for next day is going to come from. Or you can be a successful American professional. Say you and your wife are bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Have you solved the survival game? Not really, not necessarily, and not totally, as this year of 2020 has shown us. Because there are a lot of people who are doing remarkably well who suddenly are out the door. Executives, managers, as much as anybody else. And suddenly, if you have these 100 six-figure salaries that aren't coming in anymore, you have a survival problem. Will you still probably eat? Yeah. But what about the $750,000 house on which you have a mortgage? Things can get really scary. And as I think any of you will be willing to admit, if you've ever had any money worries, It feels very much like a gut-wrenching survival issue, especially when you wake up at 5 in the morning and start thinking about your checking account vis-a-vis your bills and your expenses. I can assure you that I've been there. And I have no assurance that it will not be so in the future. So we're playing this game all the time. And we have to pay attention to it all the time. When you get toward my age, which is in the 60s, you start having to think about your retirement. At some point, you're not going to be willing or able to work. So how much money do you have to live on? Retirement becomes a major issue. What are you going to survive? Are you going to eat dog food with your Social Security check? That's not a very desirable outcome, although many people have had to resort to that. How do I deal with it? Well, it requires a lot of complex planning and strategizing. Many people today say, quite honestly and quite accurately, I can't afford to retire. Well, a lot of people don't want to because they enjoy their jobs. But sometimes life in the form of your health decides you're retiring today. You may not have planned it, but you're retiring today permanently. Who knows why? So we're playing the survival game all along. And with any luck, it's not a pressing worry. In middle-class America, people are generally not worried about their food in the next few weeks. But it could change. I think the coronavirus alerted everybody to just how fragile and precarious our supply chain was and is. And we were lucky in that up to now. I'm talking in September of 2020. Up to now, we have been lucky in that, well, yeah, there was a big run on toilet paper and Sani wipes and that kind of thing. It wouldn't have to be much worse or much harder before the provisions of basic life might become challenged. And people bought into this because people have a strong survival instinct. During the coronavirus in its early phases, people were buying up sacks of rice and pasta because there might not be any next week. Nobody knew then. Sometimes it seems like an overreaction, but it only seems like an overreaction in retrospect. So we all have these concerns, and they're all going to keep surfacing. At present in the United States, we have a number of extraordinary emergencies, not only the coronavirus, but the fact that the western third of the United States is on fire. There's a hurricane in the Gulf Coast, and all of these bring up survival issues. And your expensive house in the Hollywood Hills is not immune. Many people have learned that. And it's always wise to keep that in mind. That's the survival game, and we're always playing it. It's part of the human game. Now, if you're only playing this game, one, let's say you actually manage to survive pretty well on a day-to-day basis. You haven't won the game permanently, let me emphasize. But it's definitely in the background for a while, hopefully forever. So let's turn to another. It's almost, in many ways, a continuation of the survival game. But let's call it the love game. Now, love, of course, has many, many meanings, in English as in other languages, and has been used to cover all sorts of totally different and even incompatible things. But you can see that love is intimately tied up with survival. In a very basic sense, if you're 3 months old, your love and your survival instinct are identical. There's mommy, however clearly or vaguely you conceive of her, and she's the source of your love, she's the source of your survival. It's simple, but of course, as you develop, it gets less simple. Let's take one just small fragment of the love game. I wrote a book called Conscious Love about this subject, and there are many, many facets to it, which I'm not going to have time to get into tonight. But let's at least begin by viewing it, as I say, as a continuation of the survival game. We all learned this in biology class, right? Because not only do you want to go on surviving as long as you can, but for some reason the whole thing is set up so you're not going to survive very long. All of us have only a few decades at most. So the solution to this, from a biological point of view, is reproduction. Well, if I'm not going to survive, at least my genes can survive. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than this, and I think it's a lot more complicated than biologists often portray it, but definitely that is going on. And the love game in that form starts at puberty. It's very interesting to see and listen to pop songs, because most pop songs are about puberty, to say, well, the extended adolescence of the typical American adult. It's all about courtship. Are you faithful or you're not? Am I going to get so-and-so? Well, I thought we had a good thing going, but he turned out to be a louse. Pretty much all pop songs are variants of this. And so they're about this phase of the love game. I mean, there's one song in which, you looked right through me across a crowded dance floor. Well, that happens. 1 minute, a mysterious stranger looks through you on a crowded dance floor. And the next thing you know, she's driving the kids to soccer in a Disney World sweatshirt. That's the next phase of it. I think married people will generally say that those pop songs, they may be very effervescent and we kind of listen to them so we can stay awake while driving, but they don't really feel as if they have a lot to do with us. So the next phase of it comes with driving the kids to soccer in the sweatshirt, because now you've reproduced and everything changes. I could also have delivered this lecture viewing life as a series of problems. And the problematic nature of life is itself a very profound subject. But, okay, you found your perfect mate. You get married, you had the white dress and drinking champagne out of a slipper or God knows what. Well then, as my father-in-law said to me when my first son was born, now it begins. And few words could have been more accurate than that, because then the love game continues in the form of your kids. You're not worrying whether some beautiful girl is going to return your call anymore, at least not if you're lucky or smart. You're worried about, oh my God, I've got this job and I've all sorts of demands. My wife is working too. It's just terrible. And that is the next phase of the love game, and you're playing it. So here, hey, notice the survival game continuing, because now you have to provide not only for yourself, but you have dependent children to provide for. And that changes the game quite a bit. It, of course, makes you more responsible, if you have any sense at all. It means you have to be a little more foresighted. And you suddenly have a lot of preoccupations because you're very, very intimately bound up emotionally with the fate of these rather helpless creatures. And personally, as a parent, I can say I've always found that rather unsettling. I'm doing my best, but I always get a sense of like, wow. As I think most parents would agree, when someone asks you, how's it going with the kids, the best possible answer is fine up to now. So that is the love game. And it continues on into, eventually they grow up, they have their own kids, you become a grandparent, and most people claim they enjoy being grandparents more than they did parents, which is not hard to understand. And the game goes on. You fade out of life, and you've got the new generation replacing you. It would seem that most people want something like this. It seems that most people want a significant life partner and usually offspring. Now, this life partner usually is of the opposite sex. Sometimes it's the same sex. Sometimes, well, things are kind of fluid these days. You could get married. You could get married to a woman and find, well, you're married to a man now. It does happen. But it all comes to the same thing, because it's just a matter of human relations. However you choose to live it out. Most people seem to find some kind of satisfaction in this family relationship. One would hear, if people are asked what's most important to them, the most common answer, as far as I've ever heard, is my family. And this is, it should be. Many people don't really go past these two games. And many people find these two games fully satisfying. There's nothing particularly wrong with that. It's not a complete picture of the games of human life. Because if everybody were like that, life would be kind of placid. Life would be a pleasant, white, middle-class suburban neighborhood where everybody mowed the lawns and said hi to each other and cleaned up their dog's waste. But the world is a lot not like that. And the fact that the world is not like that has to be explained in terms of another game, which is power. And power, like love, has many meanings, but the best summation of power comes in a classic work by Thomas Hobbes called Leviathan, published in 1651. And about a page and a half is dedicated to his definition of power. I'll read a little bit of it. The power of a man to take it universally is his present means to obtain some future apparent good, and is either original or instrumental. Instrumental are those powers which are means and instruments to acquire more riches, reputation, friends, and the secret workings of God, which men call good luck. Reputation of power is power, because it draweth with it the adherence of those that need protection. Affability of men already in power is increase of power, because it gaineth love, and so on. So there's this sense that you not only want to feed yourself and have an adorable little flock of children around the Christmas tree every year, but there's another aspect to it. How much influence can you have in the world? Again, this is by no means separate from the other two games. I'm speaking about them in linear terms because that's how you have to speak about things, because language is linear. But these, of course, are totally mixed, because why do I want to have power? Well, some people want to have power because they grew up in wretchedness and poverty, and they want to make sure that at all costs their children don't live in wretchedness and poverty. So they exert themselves to the extreme and make millions of dollars. And having millions of dollars extends your influence, as Hobbes would I think, agree. So you have more power. If you're a billionaire, you have a hell of a lot more power than the ordinary desk clerk in some corporation. Because, hey, the president might not reply to your call, but if it's a billionaire calling, there's a lot better a chance that he will than if it's an ordinary Joe. So you extend your influence, you extend your influence. Well, to what end? And of course, people can lose track of their own goals and their own ends. And something that was, as Hobbes would say, instrumental, that is, you want to get it so you can get something else, becomes an end in itself. And that certainly is the case with power. And power means control or influence on others. Now, there are good types of power and influence and bad types. The good type is, what does he call it? Well, anyway, affability of men. The more affable you are, the more people like you, the more powerful you are. If you're nasty to everybody, at least in ordinary life, you're going to lose friends and uninfluence people. People will avoid you. If you need a favor from someone, they will be looking at the exit and get away at the soonest minute possible. Because people are basically the same. We like nice people. We don't like not nice people. That is, shall we say, the good side of power. Of course, the good side of power explains almost nothing about human history, which is more or less a continuous record of the bad side of power. And that is dominance through fear, through control, through intimidation. And obviously, there are people who have an enormous appetite for doing this. I am not going to list any names from past or present because I don't want people's minds veering off into what direction and what about so-and-so and so-and-so. You can all think of plenty of your own examples, living and dead. Here you extend your power by fear and control. And you extend it by getting people who fear you enough to get others to fear them. And that is known as tyranny. And that is, by and large, in some respects, probably the most common form of government, both now and in the course of human history. This is not a nice thing to think about, but it is the case. The founding fathers set up the Constitution because they were acutely aware that things lead in this direction. Benjamin Franklin, at the Constitutional Convention, said, probably sooner or later it will all end in despotism, when people are capable of no other form of government. It is not really very comforting to listen to this or think about this in the light of current events. But I'm not going to comment on current events. So there is control, and it lasts, it lasts. There are people who control tens of millions of lives. And they can wipe out millions of lives at their whim and have done so. Why do people obey? Well, let's put it this way. Not to forestall myself, but there are not a lot of people who want to play another game of life, which is called courage. Courage is probably the most misunderstood game, and it is one that everyone plays a little bit, because you have to have a little courage, but there are some people who play with it a lot more. And I think this explains certain otherwise mysterious factors of human history. In fact, let's go there. You have to have courage. Early on in the AIDS epidemic, a study was done of people who survived AIDS and people who died of it. And they viewed these people from lots of different angles, including characterology. And the people who lived had a couple of things in common. They were able to ask people for things, and they were able to say no. That is to say, they had the courage to ask somebody for something. Just, can you help me with this? Or, no, I'm not going to do it. And we all know that there are people like this, and there are people who are almost pathologically unlike this, right? There are people who just can't say no. This is not a very good way to be, usually because the person who doesn't say no keeps saying yes, 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 finally snaps, and what was a friend is now an enemy. I've seen this more often in my life than I care to think about. So you have to have some element of courage in life. But notice all of the values we've talked about so far are, to one extent or another, variants of the survival game. You need to survive on your own. You need your loved ones to survive. You need to make $1 billion, you think, because that way your kids will be fine and provided for. Of course, by the time you've made the $1 billion, your kids hate your guts, but you didn't really think of that. And chances are you deny it when you get to that point anyway, as we can see from the news. But so there's still all extensions of the survival game. And courage overlaps with it to some degree. But there's something else going on with it. And I'm thinking about this particularly in terms of a military warrior culture. Because you are somehow past the survival game. Yeah, if people are shooting at you and you're shooting at them, yes, you want to survive. But why would you put yourself in that situation to begin with? And I submit that it's about the game of courage. And courage has one peculiar aspect. Something else becomes more important than mere survival, purely understood. Why? Because you're setting aside your survival possibilities. And at least in the kind of noblest warrior forms, and I don't think these forms are extinct, although we don't see them represented very much except in the past, the warrior, in a sense, wants to cultivate something in himself, or if you like, herself, that goes beyond survival. I'm willing to cultivate something that's going to keep me there, and it's going to keep me unflinching. Therefore, there is something stronger in me than all of the desires and fears and concerns of the body. Some people have this a great deal. Some people have to work on it. Some people don't think they have it until they actually go to war. And it turns out that, hey, wow, they're really good. I kind of like this. I really hated being a shoe clerk, but this is kind of a fun game. If it weren't fun, or at least rewarding, people wouldn't do it. It raises a large question, which, of course, I can't answer, which is, well, there are certain, obviously, levels of human aggression that have to be dealt with and managed one way or another. Society's done this with war, and that isn't too good. if it's not dealt with in one way or another, comes out either as war or crime or both. But there are people who like that, who like to be exposed to that. Years ago, I used to teach philosophy at a community college. And there was one guy in one of my classes who had done 3 tours of duty in Iraq. Wow, I said, 3 tours of duty, that's amazing. Yeah, you know, it was all right. You know, it wasn't that big a deal. But it turned out he was absolutely terrified of going out on a first date. In terms of my little system here, he had the courage game down, but the love game, he was still in the 6th grade. And this is another thing. People will excel at one game and use them to compensate for their weaknesses in others. Let's take the most obvious example. Overeating. Everybody's worried about obesity, either in society or in themselves. What causes obesity? Well, of course, there are a lot of causes. But certainly self-esteem issues, sense of inferiority, possibly a feeling of a lack of love, lead people to overeat. What does this mean? Well, you're not doing too well on the love game, which not only includes family, but friends, social esteem, and whatever. You're just not doing too well at that. You don't know how to do it, or you're afraid to do it. So you compensate by overeating. And this could be said of anything. But to return to the courage game, here you're dealing with an intuition that there is something more than the physical body, and that it is more important than the physical body. And this starts to bring us toward the master game, which is beyond this and subsumes this. It is the game of self-knowledge, of really answering the questions about who we are and why we are here. There was a Hindu sage named Sri Ramana Maharshi who said that if you kept asking the question, who am I, over and over and over again as a meditative practice, you would eventually reach enlightenment. Why? Do you know who you are? No, not really. I mean, you know facets of who you are. You have a social identity. You know, I belong to a certain social class. I live in a certain area. I have certain regional, national, religious, political loyalties, whatever. Those are all, shall we say, facts about me. But are they really me? Many people believe they are. Many people would find what I've said now even a bit incomprehensible. I doubt very many people who are watching this are in that category, but certainly, possibly even a majority of human beings are. You really think you are your identity. And that's why you see such incredible antagonism about politics and religion. You're your political identity. I'm, you know, supporter of candidate X or candidate Y, party A or party B, religion 1 or religion 2. I am identified. I am that. And whenever it appears to be threatened, you start to feel threatened too. Is it a matter of your own personal survival? These days, not really. But you respond as if it is. Therefore, you've identified yourself with something you are not. Or you are very far from being in totality. The person who plays the courage game understands that you know, I'm something more than this collection of fears about survival. I have something in me that can master that and does master that. There are all sorts of sacred scriptures and parables and myths that allude to these things. Plato, in his Republic, divided everybody into 3 categories. basically the ordinary people who are interested mostly in, the survival family game. The warriors, those who are interested in the courage game, and what he called the philosophers, people who were interested in and strove toward true wisdom. Plato thought these people should be running his ideal state, but he expressed no optimism that this would ever come to pass, and it frankly hasn't. It's just as a person who has courage is able to step back from his physical desires and fears, so the wise person can even step back from powerful emotions and can look back and see that even these emotions, even the emotions that control us and govern us on a moment-by-moment basis, are not really us. I would suggest that this is one of the major goals of many meditative practices. Because as you're sitting there in quiet, all of these things come up. Of course, at first it drives you nuts because your mind is just this whole realm of chatter and nuisance and fidgeting. But if you persist a little, things start to get quieter. And you realize that you can step back from these thoughts and emotions and watch them as if they belong to somebody else. Well then, if that's the case, we go back to Sri Ramana Maharshi's question, who am I? If I'm not all these things that I think I am, and most of us, most of the time, think we are our emotions, we are our reactions. But it turns out if you look a little bit with some amount of introspection and discipline, what are you? And this really becomes the theme of the master game. And this is a game that can be played all throughout life. It can be, and in our day probably even should be played while living one's daily life. In the old days it was not so. In the old days people who were interested in this generally went to monasteries. But this model seems to be fading for whatever reason. And people are starting to have to ask this question, kind of ask this, who am I, in a very deep sense, in the course of daily life. But I don't think monastic life should be idealized. Let's say, for example, you're this poor guy in some McDonald's, you're flipping burgers, and you think, God, this is a rotten life. I'm just flipping burgers at a fast food place. There has to be more than this. I wish I was in a Zen monastery. Okay. This was actually in the New Yorker several years ago. It was about some guy in Japan who had been in a Zen monastery for some time, and he left it. And he went to Tokyo and got a job at McDonald's flipping burgers. And he loved it. Why? People liked his burgers. They enjoyed it. They were nice to him. In the monastery, everybody's incredibly nasty to him. What if you get this longing for truth very early in life? What if you go off and make this search early before you get the other things down? It can be done, and it has been done. Like everything, it has a cost. It involves a series of costs that are not quoted to you at the point of purchase. That is, you're going to pay for something in your life decisions, except you didn't really quite know how much it was going to cost in terms of effort, lost opportunities, and so on. I knew a woman years ago. She was an American woman, and she was a lama, a Tibetan lama. She had been made a lama, and she had done 3 years of solitary retreats, which is a common discipline for lamas. I think you have to at least do one. That is to say, you're sitting alone by yourself somewhere, and you're meditating or doing whatever it is you do, and somebody brings you food, and you just do what you do. And she she was in her early 40s at this point, and I said, she said, well, she was very intelligent, very personable. She was actually studying at Harvard Divinity School at the time. And she said, really, all of those years of silence really cost me in terms of social skills. So you're always paying a price. And many times, when you play the master game solely at an early age, there's a point at which you realize, I've gone as far as I'm going to go with this, for better or for worse. I'm going to have to go down, as they always say, go down from the mountain and immerse myself in daily life. Again, there are parables and myths about this. So you can play the master game. I would say that a life in which you haven't played it or even bothered to think about it or don't regard it as important or even understand it is not a life that I would want to lead. A truly solitary path is being practiced less often. You have to figure out how to withdraw from the world while being in the world. There's a saying attributed to Christ, although I really don't think he actually said it, which was be in the world but not of it. And that points to something like this. So where does this lead? Does this lead to enlightenment? Well, that's an often stated goal. But unless you're actually enlightened, I respectfully submit, you probably don't really know what enlightenment is. So it's kind of a vague, very vague, distant goal. In fact, your opinions about what it might be may be the biggest obstacles for you to reach it. I am not an enlightened being, and by the classical scriptural standards, I've never met anyone who was. So I can't really say much more about it than that. It is a potential goal. Rather than thinking about it as a kind of object to be attained, which most authorities will say is part of the problem, or could be part of a problem, it's better to take the attitude of there's always further to go. Yes, there's always further you can go. You can always go deeper in yourself. You can always explore more of the world. You're never going to exhaust it. You're never going to exhaust it because it is inexhaustible and you're inexhaustible. There are, again, various esoteric dimensions to this, which I don't have time to address. But this master game, if you start to play it and take it seriously, starts to feel like the only real game worth playing in life. However honorably you discharge your responsibilities as a member of society, as a member of a family, a member, an employee, or whatever. In fact, this game requires you to do that because you are not getting anywhere. I can tell you this with some fair assurance, having seen a lot of cases. You are not going to get anywhere in the master game without taking responsibility. That is a basic criterion. You're just not going to make it. You're not even going to be interested in it. You may go to a lecture or two or watch a video or two and end up on the couch binge watching some movie about Vikings bashing each other's heads, which seems to be a popular pastime these days. So your responsibilities in all these other games and your requirements to play all these other games are not discharged by playing the master game. At the same time, I think it's ultimately the most satisfying because we do want to know why we're here. And even if that question isn't answerable in an ultimate sense, you're not going to find a sentence in a fortune cookie that suddenly tells you the whole thing. It doesn't really work that way. Nor necessarily we would find a sentence in a sacred scripture or some holy text that's necessarily going to do any better. It is, of course, a process of living, a process of discovery. And if I've said anything about this, I hope I at least communicated the idea that it's interesting and that it's stimulating and it keeps you going, perhaps in a way that these other games don't. Because let's say you played them all well. Well, you have enough to eat, you have a decent house, you're providing decently for your family, you have some status in the world, you have a professional career and reputation, but somehow people find that's not enough. In men, it's sometimes usually called the midlife crisis. I believe women have midlife crises just as much as men do, although they may take different forms. And then they start asking, well, what is the meaning of all this? And that's a question that can never be answered simplistically, but it's a question that always has to be sat with. Much like Ramana Maharshi's Who Am I? I think I'm going to close with this. I want to end with a commercial for my latest book, A Theology of Love, which discusses Christianity, a Christian theology that I believe is actually rational, compassionate, and totally free of fear. It relies heavily on a text called A Course in Miracles. And I think it's time for this, because I think what has passed for theology for centuries now is degenerate and horrifying. So here's a remedy, A Theology of Love. I hope you will seek it out. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.